lecture on Chapter 6, the skin, more correctly, the integumentary system. So the skin in the integumentary system is made up of skin and its tissues. And again, just a reminder, two or more tissue types grouped together performing a specialized function are an organ. So the skin is, by definition, an organ. In fact, it is the largest organ in your body, at least by weight. The skin is a type of membrane known as a cutaneous membrane. It's got accessory structures, including hair, nails, glands, sensory receptors, and altogether these things make up what we call the integumentary system. Skin itself is composed of several tissue types. There are two layers, the epithelial tissue overlying a connective tissue layer. That outer layer is referred to as the epidermis. The layer below that, the deeper layer, is the dermis. So the epidermis is the outer layer. It is a layer of stratified squamous epithelium. It's actually several layers we'll talk about. And its basement membrane is between the dermis and the epidermis. Below that epidermis is the inner layer, the dermis. It's thicker of the two layers. It's connective tissue. It has a lot of collagen and elastic fibers. And just below that, there is another layer that is technically not part of the skin, but it's also not really part of any other system, so we talk about it here in the integumentary system. It's called the subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermis. It's beneath the dermis. It's an insulating layer. Has areolar and adipose connective tissue there. Again, it's not technically part of the skin, but does have blood vessels that help supply the skin. And it is the target of a hypodermic needle when you have to give one of those shots. So here's our basic structure of the skin, and you have this figure in your book. You'll see them again in the lab. That epidermis is stratified squamous epithelium resting on a basement membrane. It does not have vessels, blood vessels. Remember, epidermal tissues are avascular. The deepest layer, closest to that dermis, called the stratum basale, gets a blood supply from the dermis, and those cells therefore are alive, and they grow. They are mitotic. When they divide, one remains there as a skin stem cell. The others move forward away from the nutrient supply, and as they move upward, they become keratinocytes, and they begin to flatten and die, going through a process called keratinization, which is a hardening, dehydrating, and keratin accumulation as they move outward. We'll talk about the layers that they make up as they move their way to the surface where they are sloughed off. Keratin is a very important protein. It's a tough, fibrous, waterproof protein. It's made and stored in the cells. As the cells reach the surface, they're becoming more and more tightly packed. They develop desmosomes, forming an outer layer called the stratum corneum. And the stratum corneum is what we have on the surface of our skin, and as it gets worn and torn, it sloughs off eventually. The skin is thickest in the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. Most of the body has the thinner epidermis, so the term thick skin does refer to a specific type of epidermis, which has a layer the other most skin does not have. So if we start from the outer layer, we have the stratum corneum. That is the outermost layer. Those are dead cells. They're keratinized cells. Those are the ones that are sloughing off. Now, in thick skin, which would be the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet, there is another layer called the stratum lucidum. But in most skin, you go from stratum corneum down to stratum granulosum, and below that is stratum spinosum. And the stratum basale, or the stratum germinatum, is the deepest layer. That's the layer that gets nourishment from the dermis, so these cells are mitotic. And the function of that epidermis is to be a waterproof barrier, but you really need to understand it's not so much keeping water out of your body as it is keeping water in your body. but it is also a very good barrier for many harmful chemicals against mechanical injury, and even pathogens have trouble getting past the skin. Those are the 5 layers: stratum corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, and basale. Remember, lucidum is only present in thick skin. They have some specific characteristics which you should go through. Also in the skin, we find melanocytes. Melanocytes are located in the stratum basale, therefore they are alive and they are nourished from blood from the dermis. They produce a pigment, something that absorbs light, and this one is called melanin. That melanin absorbs ultraviolet light from the sun, and it also, because of that, provides color to our skin. It's one of the things that provides color to our skin. It's distributed into keratinocytes to protect the skin cells from damaging effects of ultraviolet light, which could include DNA damage, fibroblast damage, and unfortunately even skin cancer. There are a number of things that affect skin color. If we look at hereditary factors, all people have the same number of melanocytes, but they produce varying amounts of melanin, and that is under genetic control. There's a varying distribution in size of melanin granules. Albinos, for instance, inherit a mutation in the melanin genes, and they do not produce melanin. There are things that affect how much melanin we produce in the environment. This sunlight induces the production of more melanin. That sunlight doesn't have to come from natural sun. It's because of ultraviolet light. So ultraviolet light produced by tanning lamps will do the same thing. And even X-rays can induce color changes. The other things that affect color are physiological in nature. Oxygenation of the blood in the dermal blood vessels. If it is well oxygenated, you're going to have a pinkish look to it. If it is less oxygenated, you will have a more bluish look to it, which is referred to as cyanosis. Vasodilation and vasoconstriction of the vessels around the surface of the skin will affect the pigment. And there is another pigment called carotene, which we pick up in our diet. It has an orangish color, and that can contribute to skin color in individuals. And jaundice indicates a problem in the liver. That tends to give skin a more yellowish tinge. So exposure to sunlight, whether it comes from the sun or a tanning bed, is going to cause the melanocytes to produce more melanin and give you a darker skin, a tan. That's what you're looking for. The tanning beds, though, tend to use radiation, which can overwhelm the natural protective responses of the skin. You're a lot closer and a lot more intense. Basal cell carcinomas and squamous cell carcinomas can do arise from those epithelial cells in the skin, whereas melanomas arise from melanocytes. Melanomas are the least common type of skin cancer, but they are the most deadly of the skin cancers, causing about 80% of skin cancer deaths. Below the epidermis is the dermis, which is the inner layer of skin. It's about 1 to 2 millimeters thick. It does have structures called dermal papillae, which are ridges. They kind of, you can see them on the edge as little places where it shoots up and then comes down a little bit. That dermal papillae between the epidermal ridges binds the epidermis to the underlying tissue. It is a connective tissue layer. It does have some muscle fibers in it. There are lots of nerve cell processes in this layer, and the dermal blood vessels supply nutrients to the upper epidermal layers. We also find hair follicles here, sweat, and sebaceous glands. Some of the important receptors we find in the dermis are the lemmallated corpuscles, which are traditionally referred to as Pacinian corpuscles, but there is a movement to change the names from the discoverer or the person they've traditionally been named for a more descriptive name, and that's, as we'll see throughout the book. Tactile corpuscles for light touch, traditionally referred to as Meissner's corpuscles. The dermis has two layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. That superficial part, so closest to the epidermis, is the papillary layer. It is areolar connective tissue. It's the thinner of the two layers, and it's the location where you see those dermal papillae. The reticular layer is a deeper layer. It's got more dense, irregular connective tissues, and it is the thicker of these two. There are a number of accessory structures that go with the skin. They originate from the epidermis and go into the dermis or hypodermis. They include hair follicles, nails, and glands such as sweat and sebaceous. The accessory structures remain intact, and if accessory structures remain intact, injured or burned dermis can generally regenerate. So let's take a look at the nails. The nails are protective coverings on the ends of our fingers and toes. There are three parts to them: a plate, a bed, and a luna. The nail plate overlays the nail bed. The nail bed is the surface of the skin under the nail plate. The luna is the most active growing region. It's kind of half moon shaped at the base of the nail plate. That's where your free edge is coming from. Cells in the luna divide and move forward towards the free edge. Hair follicles. Hair is present on all of our skin surfaces except for the palms of our hands, the soles of our feet, our lips, our nipples, and parts of our external reproductive organs. The hair follicle is a tube-like depression of the epidermal cells in which the hair develops. It extends into the dermis or the subcutaneous layer. The hair itself is got a hair bulb where cells are actively dividing, a hair root, and the hair shaft. The hair shaft is like the upper parts of the epidermis. It is dead epidermal cells. The papillae contain blood vessels that are nourishing the hair, and hair color is due to the amount of melanin, different colored melanins than in skin. And when there is a smooth muscle associated with hair follicles called the erector pili, and when that is triggered, we get what we call goosebumps. Hair loss. The most common type of baldness is pattern baldness. The top of the head loses its hair. It's also called androgenic alopecia. Alopecia refers to hair loss. Androgenic is because it's under the influence of testosterone. It's associated with lower levels of testosterone in men or estrogen in women. Progenitor cells aren't there, so we get bald spots. Stem cells are present. The alopecia areata is a body produces antibodies that attack hair follicles, and this would be an autoimmune hair loss. Sebaceous glands are holocrine glands associated with the hair follicle. They produce sebum, which is a fatty material in cell debris. Sebum helps keep the hair and the skin soft and waterproof. However, excess amounts of sebum can result in acne. And we do not have sebaceous glands in thick skin, so that, again, palms of our hands, soles of our feet. Acne, acne vulgaris, which means common acne, is a disorder of the sebaceous glands. Occurs most often around puberty because sebaceous glands are being excessively activated in response to androgens. Those glands can become clogged with extra sebum and epithelial cells, and that clogging gland or clogged gland is a good environment for anaerobic bacteria that cannot survive in the presence of oxygen, and that results in an inflammatory response. Approximately 80% of people between 11 and 30 years old can be treated with vitamin A derivatives, systemic antibiotics, salicylic acid, and benzoyl peroxide. The sweat glands are also called sudoriferous glands, and they are widespread in the skin. They originate in deeper dermis or hypodermis as a ball-shaped coil. eccrine or merocrine glands are the most numerous. They respond to elevated body temperatures. The apocrine sweat glands are found primarily in our axillary and groin areas. They secrete by a different method, by exocytosis, and they work in response to emotions and pain. We also have ceremonious glands in our ears that produce earwax, and women, while they are lactating, have active mammary glands that produce milk. So here's our glands: sebaceous, merocrine, apocrine, both of those being sweat glands, ceremonious glands, mammary glands. And I will stop there. You should be familiar with all of these glands.